Hi, it's T with TeaQuilts, and I'm here with a viewer request. I was asked how to make crumb blocks, and I have showed you in plenty of videos how to make string blocks, and I'll put the playlist at the end of this video as well as down in the description or the comment box. I want to just say, when I start making crumb blocks, a lot of times I start with things that I have left over. So if I have a strip set where I've been cutting off pieces for another project, and I will save these and I'll just start building my string blocks around it. So if I have a strip set, then I might start adding a strip over here. I don't necessarily go all around. I might add 3 or 4 one way and then come back another way. And then here I had the strip sets, put a strip on top and bottom, and then I had other strip sets that were left over that I just pieced. And sometimes I just do this when I want to do mindless sewing, or if I'm doing chain piecing on my machine. I always like to keep something under my needle, so then I'll just sew any oddball things together and I come up with various different units. And at this point, I'm just sewing any scraps that are in my work area. I'm not looking for a particular size or anything. Some other ways that I make blocks is that I just might sew any scraps that I got from other projects, just piecing them together. So I had something where I was apparently cutting off half square triangles off something, and I had these extra pieces, so I just started with that and I just build around it. Here is another example of some things. So I'm just piecing any and everything together. Sometimes I might decide that I want them in a particular color scheme, so I just might sew all red scraps that I got laying around together. In this particular example, I have a piece of blue, and as you can see, it's just oddball size things that I've sewn. Nothing has a straight edge. I'm just sewing until it's big enough for me to do whatever it is that I want to do with it. And if they're too big, I can still just cut up units into smaller sections if that's what I want to do as well. The idea, you can always make bigger fabric, because that's exactly what you're doing. Is you're just building your own fabric, and you can cut whatever you want from this. And then you can also use these for crazy piecing. If you wanted to go back in and make a crazy quilt and do embellishments, you can use these as well. Sometimes I'll make little mini quilts or runners, so I'll get them pretty big and then decide if something like this could be a standalone quilt instead of in something else. Or if I want to keep going, I can make a column quilt with this as well. And then this one is very long. It's not going to show in the whole frame because I got it zoomed in, but you get the idea. So I was just making a real long piece of fabric, and if I was to continue to do that, I can either cut these into smaller sections and make a quilt with it. Sometimes I'll make totes with my pieces as well, because I love just having stringy projects. And then one time I was making Drunkard's Path blocks, and I had all of those curvy pieces left over, and I did not want to pitch them, and I ended up just sewing those together, and I didn't have to worry about anything matching. I was just sewing scraps. When I got the scraps all done, I just cut it into an approximate square that I can use on another project. Other times I may just cut my pieces apart into smaller sections, and then I can make a block with them as well. So here I'm just making my own fabric, and then sometimes I will take them and I will cut a large piece of applique out. If you want to make a baby quilt, say you want to make a little girl's quilt and you want to use pink and red hearts, so you just use your pink and red scraps, make yardage, and then you can cut out on fusible web, say a giant heart, so you're not making a whole lot of little bitty blocks. And then if it's pieced, your heart will, and with it being pieced, your heart will not be boring with one big piece of fabric. You actually got many pieces of fabric inside. So I'm going to actually show you how I sew these blocks. You can actually sew them in two ways. If you can sew it, you can sew it where you're working with one block at a time, or you can sew it where you can do it assembly line, and you can also do it where you can do it assembly line and do strip piecing with it as well. So I'll show you some of those techniques. The first thing is you have to decide if you want your block to look like a puzzle that you can't tell how it's put together. Sometimes I'll start with a straight strip and it's just a rectangle or square and I don't really care. And then other times I like starting with a 5-sided shape, because when you start to go around, you've got different angles on your pieces. And let's just say that you have a piece that's not a 5-sided shape. All you need to do is just cut off one of your corners diagonally, and then you'll end up with something like that. And so you've now got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sides to your shapes. So I have a few pieces that have some really weird little starting shapes, and that's what I'm actually going to start with. So let's get you over to the sewing machine so we can show you how to piece these units. So first we're going to just start a piece. So here I am just going to start a piece with a rectangle, and then I'm also going to start one with a 5-sided piece. And the next thing that I do is I go through my string container and I try to pull out some of my smaller pieces to start if I'm just going to make one block. And all I want to do is make sure that my piece is covering the seam allowance and leaving at least 1/4 of an inch on each side. So I'm just going to chain piece these two because I hate cutting my threads in between. So I'm going to just sew 1/4 of an inch seam. And again, on these particular blocks, the seam allowance is not critical because you're actually going to square your block up later. So once I sew my seam, then next I just press my seam over, and I am just going to go and sew a strip somewhere else. So what I do is I just take my rotary cutter and I have an angle going at this direction, so I just want to trim. I just want to trim even with the edge of the fabric. So that way I am keeping my 5-sided unit in place. And I'll now just add another piece to go across. And sometimes I'll try to see if I got shorter pieces to start with. And if not, then I'll have to cut them off of longer pieces. So I'll just take one of the big pieces here, lay it down, and I'll just whack off a piece that's slightly bigger. I want to make sure that I got at least 1/4 of an inch on both sides of my seam. then with this particular one, this wedge is not straight. I'm not going to straighten it up at this point. If I wanted to put more angles into the block, I can put my ruler at an angle instead of going straight across. So let's just go ahead and do that. Sometimes you might have pieces that might fit that angle, so I will also just sew whatever I can fit onto the unit. And for me, I just finger press, or I use my wooden iron, and then when I get almost finished or close to being done, then I might go to a regular iron and press my seams. So again, I just want to make sure I have a quarter, and I'm just going to stop when I get to the end. So I have another piece I just trimmed off, made a straight edge, and I just want to sew my next seams. So crumb piecing is really just mindless sewing. You sew whatever you want to something else, just trying to make sure it's long enough to fit the piece. And if not, if it's too short and you accidentally sewed something too short, you can always come back across that short edge with something else as well. So here I left the piece on, and then all I would do is when I got ready to sew across this way, I would just trim it off at that point. So let me trim that, and I'll come back into the frame. So all I did was just trim that off, and then I just find something else that will fit the length. And if it doesn't fit the length, or if I feel like I'm going to cut off a lot, then I won't sew it. But if I'm only going to cut off a little, maybe it's okay to sew it down. If you're going to go through all the trouble to piece crumb blocks and make your own, you want to make sure that you do have some contrast between the fabrics, unless you're doing something where you're working with a particular colorway. But then I will still try to make sure that I had different values in that as well if I'm going to go through all the trouble of piecing crumb blocks. So I've already showed you a lot of crumb blocks that I've made, but I just wanted to show you how they get started and how they actually grow. So I'm just going to stop working with these two for now so that I can show you another method for doing crumb blocks. So I could have done just one block at a time, but I wanted to chain piece, so I showed you how to do 2 blocks at a time actually. So now I'm going to show you how to do strip piecing of some blocks. So I'm just going to work with these 3 centers here to start. What I want to do is just pull a fabric strip set, and I am actually going to lay a line on the strip set, and I'm going to start sewing. When I get to the end, I'll just add another one. And again, add another one. When I get to the end, I can just sew off my strip set. But ideally, I would be adding more pieces all the way through to the strip set. And this method is pretty great when you're making a lot of blocks for a large quilt. If you're making a small quilt, you don't want all of your blocks to look alike. So I wouldn't necessarily do it at that point. So now I'm just going to get something that I can chain piece with. Just to get my strip set off. So this is what we have actually sewn here. So then what I would do is I will trim off my pieces just to get them loose. So now I got all of my 3 pieces trimmed, and then I just press my seam over. And after I press my seams open, then I go back and I decide, okay, which line do I want to sew on now? So if I want to sew this line, then I'm just going to go cut and get me a straight line. So let me do that. That's even with my 5-sided unit. So now I can go and sew a piece across the top. And all you really want to do is get a straight line. It can be at an angle. It doesn't have to be a true squared line. So now I have my 3 pieces with a straight side. And now I can get a different strip set and sew those units. So you're actually working on as many blocks as you can fit onto your strip sets. And even if you run out, you can add, keep going with an added strip set. So you can work on many blocks with this method. And I just like to lift my presser foot to get it under there so that I'm not wasting as much fabric in between. I try to leave like a 1/2 inch or so. I don't mind wasting that much. After all, these are all scraps and they were going to go into the trash bin. So and then once I get to the end, I'm just going to sew off. I'm just going to square up one of my first blocks just so I can get an angle to sew. And also, don't get wrapped into you have to go all the way around in order. You don't have to go all the way around in order. So I put this one on 3rd. It was my 3rd piece of fabric. So I'm just going to go across here. This was my last one. Ideally, you might want to go across here, but there is no rules in crumb piecing. I'm going to square this end up and then go across that end. And so here are here's my strip set now. And again, I just keep pressing the seams open. And then I can also then just cut that off of my strip set. And I would keep going, adding pieces until the blocks or units were as big as I like. So I've just cut all of my pieces off, and notice I'm not worried about the end that I'm not going to sew. I'm only worried about what is it that I'm going to sew next. So I'm just looking for one straight edge at any given time. I'm going to stop here because you get the general idea. You just keep adding these units onto strip sets. But do be aware that, you know, when you're using the same fabrics in a lot of blocks and you're only making, say, 12 blocks, then your blocks will start to look the same and they'll sort of look patterny. But if you're making a quilt where you're having 50 to 75 blocks, then chain piecing on strings, your blocks will be more spread throughout the quilt. So that is all that I have for, I call it mosaic piecing or crumb piecing. And if you have any questions or need me to answer any other details about crumb piecing, just leave it down in the comment field. And I am just going to end here, and I'll say see you in my next video. Bye bye for now.